More than 42% of adults are now obese, making it the first time the national rate has passed the 40% mark. One reason? We consume 3 times the recommended amount of sugar.
Is sugar the prime culprit in chronic diseases like obesity and diabetes? In today's podcast, Dr. Chris Knobbe, a physician and ophthalmologist turned ancestral nutrition researcher, renowned speaker, and public health advocate, and myself will be answering this exact question. And at the end of this podcast, Chris will be sharing never before released research showing the effects of sugar and carbohydrates on a population of 4.5 billion people covering 17 different countries. Before we jump in, if you would like to take your understanding of the prime culprits of chronic disease to the next level, I highly recommend checking out Chris's book, The Ancestral Diet Revolution. In this book, Chris has taken Dr. Weston A. Price's work to the next level, detailing the statistical relationships and mechanisms of processed foods in driving chronic disease while simultaneously comparing the ills of modernized diets to the wisdom of ancestral diets. Now, I want to preface our conversation with a few key points. Chris and I are not here to encourage people to smash sodas or to drink maple syrup from the bottle. We are not here to engage in dietary tribal warfare of carbs versus fats. We are both here after coming from multiple different dietary backgrounds, including low carb, keto, etc., trying to understand what is driving the chronic disease epidemic across the world, as well as trying to understand how we can reverse it. Further, Chris is trying to answer this question from a public health perspective, while I'm trying to answer this question from a clinical perspective. So with this said, welcome back, Chris. I'm honored to have you here with us today. In our last podcast, we discussed seed oils as prime culprits in chronic diseases like diabetes and obesity. So I want to start today with asking you just how bad over the past century have diabetes and obesity become in our modern times?
Well, first of all, thanks, Mike, for having me on again. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be on with you. So obesity and diabetes are absolutely exploding, not only in the United States, but around the entire world. And I'll start with just 2 slides that kind of take me back for those who have seen me present before, where I show that both of these conditions have just exploded. This slide, you can see that in the United States, obesity was at 1.2% in the last couple of decades of the 19th century, and actually the first about 17 years of the 20th century. And you can see that then it actually rose 11-fold by 1960 to 13%. We can see that by 1999, we're at 30.5%, all the way to 2018, 42.5%. This is a 35-fold increase in obesity in 118 years. Diabetes, so there was published evidence that came from Sir William Osler in 1890 that diabetes prevalence was only 0.0028% in 1890. That was about 1,700 people in the United States that had diabetes out of 63 million. That's how rare it was. And that number increased 132-fold to 0.37%. You can see right here by 1935. And then it practically triples again by 1960. By 1991, it triples again. That doubles between 1991 to 2010 to about 7%. And we can see that by 2023, we're at 15.8%. So this is a 5,643-fold increase in diabetes in this period of time, which is 133 years. And I remind people that if any one of these conditions, if they would have doubled, that would have absolutely been statistically significant. But look at this incredible increase. Now, this is what these actually look like if you put them on a graph. And you can see this extraordinary explosion of both of these conditions. And you can see how well they parallel one another, that they run very, very closely together. But look at the incredible vertical increase we've seen in both of these since about 1990. And we'll get into why shortly.
So, I guess one thing to mention with this, there's a couple things that come to mind with the general or the traditional medical hypothesis. A lot of talk is about genetics, right? It's like these are genetic problems. But from a genetic standpoint, it seems unlikely that that it's going to happen in this time frame, right? 100 years shouldn't be enough time for random mutation to drive up these disease processes. And this is something that when I first found Dr. Weston A. Price's work, which is, I know his work had also inspired some of your work, if I remember correctly, that it was like pretty startling to see that even within like a generation, you could see massive changes in health and different disease processes with dietary components. And I think that's important because this is the foundation of we're trying to figure out what's causing these things. And it doesn't really seem to be so much genetics, right? The trend doesn't really make sense. So that leads us to hone in onto diet. And when we're honing in onto diet, the questions that we're asking ourselves is what changed from then until now? And this was a question that Dr. Weston A. Price has covered in his book, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. But then also you've greatly expanded on with your work, trying to understand like what has actually changed from previous points of time where we didn't have these diseases to now. Now, some of the common causes that we hear about in different dietary spheres are sugars and carbohydrates, the insulin hypothesis, right, for these different disease processes like diabetes. But the question is from I guess the fundamental questions that we're going to answer today is, are sugars and carbohydrates the cause of obesity and diabetes? Do they track with your research? And then if they aren't the cause, what is the actual cause? So I think those are the two big questions that we want to cover today, and look at the differences in diet from these different time frames. And you have some really interesting statistical data to show us today. Before we get into that statistical data, on our previous podcast, we went through some of this. There was a couple questions in the comment section, and I want to clear this up because I think when I had asked you about it separately, you gave me a really solid answer on this. And the question is, how do we know that we can actually trust the data that you're using here? Where is this data coming from that you're using to create the graphs that you just showed us, and then also the graphs that we're going to see throughout the rest of this presentation? And how strong is it? Like, how good is this data?
Right. Well, let me first I want to address your comments regarding the genetics. Could genetics be a driver? Which is, as you just pointed out, is really what allopathic medicine. That's the position that they hold for a lot of things. Well, it's just aging and genetics is what they would say. But yeah, and I can't remember the exact numbers. I've addressed this in my book, but if I recall correctly, the geneticists and the evolutionary biologists would suggest that our DNA has not changed, is something like 99.9%, if not higher, in the same as it was 10,000 years ago. I think that's roughly correct. So the amount that has changed in 100 years is infinitesimally small. So this is not genetics, and it's not aging, and that's a whole section to cover in itself, but it's certainly not those things. All right. So about the data, because when people don't like theories or they don't like hypotheses, one of the first things they do is attack the data. This happens in our business, in nutrition. It happens in courtrooms. With attorneys, they attack data if they don't like the data. Sometimes for good reason. But this data, so all of the food consumption data that I'll present today comes really from two places, the USDA and the FAO. So the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, first of all, provides the single most comprehensive and internationally standardized estimates of food availability and apparent per capita consumption globally. There is no other data source that compares. The FAO stat data, it will absolutely overestimate consumption because this data is food availability, not actual consumption. So there's precious few studies where they've actually try to analyze or give you food consumption data for the entire country. The NHANES data does that, and it does a pretty good job. But there's precious little of that around the world. So, but the FAO stats considered the most reliable, respected, and authoritative database for food consumption across the globe. It's been used in thousands of peer-reviewed nutrition studies, including the majority of global dietary trend papers. It's widely regarded as the primary data source for ecological and cross-national analyses of food availability. So this data is extremely solid.
And Chris, just to, I guess, clarify a little bit. So in terms of, because we're going to cover data from the US and we're also going to cover data across the world, this FAO data that you're mentioning, it's literally the best source of data we have looking at other countries outside the United States. Is that correct?
It is, yeah, it's generally the only source for most countries, for the huge majority of countries. It's the only source of data available. Now, we have found, Mike, that all of the developed nations seem to have, you can trust that data. It's extremely solid. I would not say that about some of the very small countries, like some of the Caribbean island countries, Pacific island countries, both of those, for example, that data I would not rely on it because these governments, they're too small and too unorganized to track what's going on in their own countries. So you can't really rely on the data there. But for large countries that are developed, this is extremely solid data. It's the best there is.
Okay. And then in the US, though, there's other data that actually can look at consumption patterns, not just food availability from an economic standpoint, right? So we have the best data is in the US and we have a data set for that. And then for the rest of the world, there's this other, basically the only other data set is this FAO data set that we're talking about. So when people are questioning the data here, it's like this is the data set. These are the data sets to use. There's no other real sources that we can use to get this type of information that's reliable and looks at so many different countries. So even if you're going to make an argument, well, this data set's perfect, it's like, okay, show us another data set. Where's the other one that you want to use, right?
Yeah. Yeah, anybody who says that, they're not going to have like you just mentioned, they're not going to have another data set. There won't be one. For most countries, for the enormous majority of countries, they won't have any other data sets.
Well, I think that's important to point out because it's like if you're gonna, if there was a better data set than the ones that we have, and these ones that you mentioned are very good data sets, they've been used in thousands of studies, then if there was a better one, you probably would have used it and then compared between them. And if we want to get answers to some of these questions and try to understand the relationships, to try to expand upon this work, like this is what we have to use. So it's not really an argument to try to fully question the data set here so much. I'm sure that there's going to be some limitations of it, of course, but I think it's just I want to point this out because it's important for people listening to understand that this is the data to use. This is and we're going to look at the U.S. as well as I think the U.S. the 17 countries data include the U.S. So 16 other countries, and look at the relationships in their food data across them. So we'll talk about that now. Since we steel man the data set, we covered that. Like that's one of the first things that people go to. Let's jump directly into obesity now. So let's start with obesity, and then we'll get to diabetes after. Now, another hypothesis that we get pushed from the mainstream medicine, instead of genetics, is this calories in, calories out hypothesis. And the idea is that obesity is caused by basically people's gluttony and laziness, right? So people just eat too much and they don't move enough. They're just getting way too many calories, and this is why they're actually getting obese. So if people just ate less food and moved more, they would be a lot better off. So I want to first address this hypothesis and then we can start talking about sugar and carbohydrates, because I think, we're kind of trying to like myth bust a little bit here and clear the air on some of these components, because I don't think the data supports some of these hypotheses super well. And one thing before we jump in, that for this section of the podcast, for everyone listening, we're going to go through data in the US here, and then we're going to get into some of the data in other countries afterwards. So all the data that we're going to go through in these next couple sections is going to be from the US, and then we're going to compare this stuff that we see in the US to things that we see in other countries. So with that, let's tell us about the gluttony and sloth hypothesis of obesity.
Okay, well, I won't be able to cover the sloth exactly, at least not with data today, Mike, but I can cover the gluttony. And it starts with this paper that came out in 2022 from Dariush Matsafarian at Tufts University in Boston. And I think this represents what allopathic medicine believes about obesity. And as the title tells you here, prospective obesity, an unexplained epidemic. And in this paper, this is a very short paper, but it's very interesting, very powerful, because in this paper, Matsafarian shows, well, first of all, let me start with the obesity. Between 1999 and 2018, you can see that United States obesity climbed from 30.5% to 42.5%. Now, I've put these labels on here just to make this easy to read. These are not there in the original paper, all right? But I used his original graph. And you can look at, this is a total energy available, and this would come from the USDA in this case, I'm quite certain. And again, the USDA and the FAO, we use both data sets because they both track very carefully, and they're derived in different ways, which I think this supports and buttresses what we've presented. But anyway, you can see here the total energy available has been almost flat. In fact, after 2003, right in here, energy availability actually goes down, and it's statistically significant, Matsafarian notes. And then you look at the total energy consumed, and this is actual food consumed, which I believe, if I remember right, comes from the N. study. And you can see that right here, after 2003 and 4, energy consumption actually went down while obesity goes up. So Matsafarian throws up his hands essentially in this paper and says, we really don't know what's causing obesity, because people are not eating, there's not more food available, and they're not eating more.
Before you jump into sugar, there's just one thing I want to point out, and this is something that's gone in some of the social media stuff, is people have pointed to data showing total energy availability and said, see, the energy intake is almost 4,000 calories a day. It's 3,500, 3,700 calories a day. When looking at some of that data and comparing it to other times. And it's like, no, that's energy available, not energy consumed. When we see the energy consumed, it's somewhere in the low 2,000 calories on average. And I think that's important to point out, because there's people inside some, like in social media right now, who are pointing to this high intake, and this is not the case. The energy availability is how much of total calories are available in the food supply, and that's based on some like the FAO data stuff, right? And this is economic information to some extent, whereas the energy consumed is literally looking at people's consumption patterns for energy. And so there's going to be a disparity, because the amount of energy that is available is going to be more than what people are actually consuming, right? I just want to point that out and make that clear, and also mention this because I've seen this talked about a couple times, and it's not correct to point to the energy availability as what people are actually eating. So I wanted to point that out. And basically what you're saying is people are eating, on average, based on this data, or at least this study, they're eating somewhere around the low 2,000 calories. And it's actually, the total consumption has decreased from basically the early 2000s to up into 2018.
Yeah, I'll just move this number right here, and you can see that what they're consuming is around 2,250 calories a day. It's right around that, and it's pretty much flat. And that's a really good point. So, Mike, the USDA, they routinely on their data, their when they estimate data, or I'm sorry, the consumption of food based on the food availability data, they normally would subtract around. It used to be 29% on, but I think it was slightly different on different items. But yeah, almost a third, a fourth to a third of the food they figure gets thrown away or it's not consumed. There's losses in cooking, there's plate losses, people leave food on their plate, that kind of thing. And so yes, there's there is a significant difference there. By the way, if I had thought about it, I have data that shows that the only time in the last 120 years, I mean, since we have data from 1909 going forward from the USDA, at least through 2009, the only time that calories were going up in the United States at the same time that obesity went up was between 1977 and 1997. That's basically, or maybe 2003. But, if you want to get nitty gritty, but there's only about a 20-year period in the last 100 years plus where food consumption is actually going up along with obesity. All the rest of the time, it's not. It's either a lot of that food consumption was going down, and while obesity went up.
So when you change the timeline, the relationship is drastically different.
Yeah. I wished I'd have put that in here for us to review, but I can show that later. But it's absolutely true. So obesity, most all of the time, 80 some percent of the time, obesity has been increasing while the calories did not.
That's actually, I mean, that to some extent blows the energy hypothesis out of the water here.
It absolutely does.
Okay, so if it's not calories, right, total caloric intake, and we're not going to cover the sloth portion. So the next one is sugar. So the question is now, are sugar, and then we'll get into also carbohydrates, are they driving obesity based on your data?
Right. Okay, so here is the sugar consumption data for the U.S. versus obesity in the U.S. And this data set, there are two data sets published that have sugar consumption going back to before the USDA tracked it, but it was tracked by the Department of Commerce. And so one of my colleagues tracked it back to sugar consumption way back here to 1840. And Stefan Guillenet, PhD, his team, they tracked it clear back to 1822. And that's where this data set came from. But both of them are published in the scientific literature. I mean, it's accurate data. But anyway, here, I didn't put any numbers on this graph because I just wanted people to see the gestalt, that there's not a very good correlation between obesity and sugar consumption. Sure, they're both going up at the same time, but as we get into the nitty gritty here, you'll see that there are some significant disparities here as you look at obesity climbing drastically while sugar does not. And here, I'll start with this. So this is pretty interesting. In 1890, and people don't realize this, but Americans loved their sugar and they loved their sweets and desserts back in the 19th century. Roughly a fourth to a third of most cookbooks were devoted to desserts. They loved their pies, particularly, and sugar was common. But anyway, you can see that even by 1890, sugar consumption was already 211 calories a day. This is when food consumption was about 1950 calories a day, is what would be estimated. Anyway, you can see that it was already 10.8% of calories. That's more than the World Health Organization recommends today. And yet, why was obesity so low? 1.2%, right? And if you jump over here to 1930, you can see that sugar consumption's 499 calories a day. That was 25% of calories. A fourth of our food consumption was coming from sugar by 1930. And people will argue this and argue this, but it doesn't, if they don't believe the data in the United States, well, we've got data that shows this, similar things with, not just the United States, but the United Kingdom, Australia, Japan, Israel, on and on, where sugar has been flat for decades or going down in those, all those I just mentioned, it's going down in recent decades. While obesity and diabetes go up. But anyway, let's get back to this. So 1930, 499 calories. Look at this. If we jump over here to 2016, we're only at 526 calories a day of sugar, 27 calories more sugar than we were in 1930. And yet obesity in 1930 was roughly 3%, and it's 42.5%. So anybody that looks at this, if you have any logic at all, you'll say there's an extreme disconnect here between sugar consumption and obesity. I want to just throw this in, Mike. This is the FAO definition of added sugars. And this is the exact same definition for the USDA. It says, quote, added sugars include sugars added during the processing of foods, such as sucrose and dextrose, foods packaged as sweeteners, such as table sugar, sugars from syrups, which would include corn syrup, high fructose corn syrup, maple syrup, etc., and honey, and sugars from concentrated fruit or vegetable juices. They go on to say this: for most Americans, the main sources of added sugars are sugar-sweetened beverages, baked goods, desserts, and sweets. So this is every form of added sugar there is. And now this has been going around for quite a while. I'll just say that many people will know who said this, but I'm not going to mention that. But there's a claim made that there's 56 different names for sugar, so national statistics miss most of it. Here's the facts on this. The USDA and the FAO, they both track sugar at the source, not at the retail level. So the total of sugar is total production plus imports minus exports plus or minus stock changes. That's how they calculate it. They don't track the sugar at the retail level. Doesn't matter if you give sugar 500 different names, it's still sugar. The core sugar commodities that they're tracking largely for the purposes of taxation are these: cane sugar, beet sugar, corn sweeteners, including high fructose corn syrup, all syrups, honey, glucose, dextrose, and molasses. So the claim that sugar is underreported due to naming conventions at the point of sale is absolutely false and misleading. It just isn't true.
So basically what you're saying is, because the initial claim is that there are a variety of different naming conventions for sugar that would be put on labels, right? So like food products and stuff like this. And what you're saying is it doesn't really matter what you call it on the label, because they're the major sources of sugars that the USDA and FAO data is tracking is the like core production sources, right? So the like all the different sources that you could that are sugar could be considered sugars. They're tracking those from a production level, or from a not only a production level, but from an economic level. And then those would then filter down to things being put on the label. So you don't really need to have all 56 different names for sugar tracked on the labels. You just need to go further upstream to the production, imports versus exports, and see like what are the major driving sources that would be then named on the label, something else down the road, and track those components. And the data actually tracks those components. So it's kind of a moot point to say, hey, there's 56 different names for sugar, so the statistics are missing it. But the statistics aren't tracking it down at that level. The statistics are tracking it for multiple levels upstream. Correct?
If a food production company wants to put sugar in their product and they want to call it component X or whatever, they're going to have to get that sugar from the source, right? They're going to have to get, cane sugar, beet sugar, corn syrup, or whatever, high fructose corn syrup, right? It's already been tracked. So yeah, it doesn't matter what they call it.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. So the further bolstering the statistics, the data set you're working with.
Exactly. Yeah, that's critically important. Yeah. And they're good questions to, that we need to dig into this. So if we go back to this data now, I purposely picked out this period. You want to look at all the data, and then at certain places you zoom in. Well, this slide right here is 65 years worth of data from 1922 to 1987 in the United States. And I just want to show sugar consumption versus obesity. And look at the sugar consumption. I got to go back, Mike, and say this, because people will say, oh my gosh, the sugar consumption has gone way up, and that I've already pointed that out. It's gone up 17-fold since 1822 from Stephan Guyenet's data, something like 15 or 16-fold since 1840. But the thing about it is almost all the increase in sugar consumption took place by 1922 or 1930. After that, you can see that it's almost flat for most of the rest of our history. So here we are, 473 calories worth of sugar consumption in 1922, 497 calories in 1987, 65 years later. That's a 5% difference, a 5% increase. Look at obesity, 2.95% in 1922, 18.6% in 1987. So during this period, sugar increased 5%, obesity increased 532%, or 6.32 fold, again, over 65 years. But now, okay, so we know that just can't, if you want to try to argue that sugar is driving obesity, what are you going to do with this data? I mean, what are you going to say about that? But if you put vegetable oil in the mix here, and I won't go through the numbers on sugar again, look at the vegetable oil, 78 calories worth of consumption in 1922, all the way to 550 calories in 1987. So during this 65-year period, sugar increased 5%, vegetable oils increased 605%, obesity increased 532%, or 6.32 fold. So it almost went up 1-for-1, right, on vegetable oil versus obesity.
Yeah, so the vegetable oil graph or trend matches obesity much better than sugar, which has essentially been flat, right? So you're looking at what, a 24 calorie difference. So that's going to be like that's essentially nothing. It's like 6 grams of sugar. That's a teaspoon and a half of sugar over from, we're at what, 1922 to 1990.
Yeah.
So it's trivial increase in sugar, and then vegetable oil had a massive increase, right? 78 calories to 550 calories.
Right.
So that's a huge. So that you basically, the trend matches this better. And if you go back to the initial graph that you had, where you were looking at sugar consumption and obesity, maybe if you looked at, when you look at 1890, obesity is 1.2%. And sugar consumption is 211 calories. And then you go to 1930, obesity is 3 to 4%, and sugar consumption is 499 calories. So okay, so there's kind of a doubling, but then after that, it just doesn't track anymore. From that point forward, the relationship doesn't really seem to track so much. So that's where the vegetable oil comes in. But I guess the question is, and this is something that I think you'll get from the low carb sphere, what about carbohydrates in general, right? So if you exonerate sugar, there's still other sources. So is it grains? Is it breads? Is it pastas? Is it stuff like this? Do carbs track with obesity? I think would be another question, if sugar doesn't track.
Right. And so we have that data too. And here it is. And this comes from the carbohydrate consumption data, comes from the USDA in this case. And you can see, and it's just, nobody questions this data because it's all so well supported. But you can see from 1909 to 2009 over here, the carbohydrate consumption that's about as flat as you could pretty much get. You can see it's mostly, for most of the century, it was actually going down. And then beginning here around 1977, right here, carbohydrates went up. And this is where I told you that actually everything went up. Carbohydrates went up, sugar went up. And by some evidence, even fat went up for this short period of time, this about 20-year period. This is when I told you that the food consumption went up, and that's the only time it was going up. But you can see here that we don't have any correlation between carbohydrates and obesity here at all. Carbohydrate consumption, 500 grams per person per day in 1909. Right over here in 2009, it's around 480 grams. It's actually lower. So again, for carb theorists, well, again, this does not support your theory whatsoever that carbs are driving obesity.
Yeah, and I haven't even seen that play out with clients, people I'm working with, that it's fundamentally carbohydrates that are making them gain weight. So whether somebody is low carb or they have carbohydrates in their diet or they have sugars from fruits and stuff like this in their diet, like you can lose weight on all of those different diets and you can gain weight on all of those different diets. So I haven't seen that be the case, and it's also good to see not only from a clinical perspective. I've talked about the mechanistic perspective on my own videos. Jay and I have done videos about it, but also now what you're showing here is that the statistical data, the correlational data, food consumption data also doesn't show this relationship either. So there's a lot of areas where there's a couple holes in the idea that it's just carbs and sugar that are causing the problem fundamentally. There's a lot of areas that have to be corrected to show that these are, or that have to basically be adjusted or answered to show that these are the drivers, and we're not really seeing that. So for me, the next question is, if it's not carbs and sugars, then what are we actually looking at? Is there another dietary factor that tracks with obesity better? And I mean, we kind of already spoiled it before, so we'll see it, but we'll see what this component is.
Yeah, sure. So that component is vegetable oils, and throughout this data, Mike has pointed out to me that I am typically using the term vegetable oils and I do that to be accurate, because what we're tracking here in general is all the vegetable oils, but the ones that we really want to point the finger at is the industrial seed oils. But just so people know, that the vast majority of our consumed vegetable oils are industrial seed oils. And let me give you the numbers here. So here we see in 1900, way back here, that when obesity was 1.2%, vegetable oil consumption was about 1.5 grams per person per day. If you jump over here to 1961, when obesity was 13.4%, vegetable oil consumption was 19 grams per person per day. And if you jump to the end of this graph, our latest data, you can see that right here, when vegetable oil consumption was 80 grams per day in 2010 and afterwards, it stayed just about the same. Obesity is 42.5%. So again, this 35-fold increase in obesity tracks in lockstep correlation to the vegetable oils. So if I bring back in the sugar now and we look at this together, I think people will begin to see that there's this striking relationship between obesity and vegetable oils, and a much less strong correlation to sugar. In fact, it's even negative in some places. But as we've seen, there's a huge stretch of time, 65 years here, where the sugar did not change and obesity is going up. And here, after 2004, right here, 2003 or 4, you see sugar begin to fall, right? Sugar consumption has been going down, and both the USDA and the FAO data and all of the data shows that, supports this, that sugar consumption has been going down in the United States. And this is when our obesity has climbed essentially the fastest. Again, it was 30.5% obesity in 1999, 42.5% in 2018. But it's tracking precisely with the vegetable oil consumption.
So basically, what we're seeing is that sugar consumption is going down, obesity is still tracking upwards, and the major component that actually trends with that is vegetable oils and not necessarily sugars. And we also saw before that it's not carbohydrates either.
Right. So it's not total calories. We showed that already.
Yeah.
And I wished I'd have had the other data to go clear back to the beginning of the century, but it doesn't So since 2003, anyway, I can say this: total calories, sugar, and carbohydrates all going down, all going down, while obesity, and we'll get to the diabetes, well, but obesity is going way up.
Yeah, so that's a good segue here too. So we covered obesity. So we covered the calories, we covered sugar, we covered carbohydrates, and we covered vegetable oils in relationship to obesity. So the next one here really is, and this is actually a big one because they're one of the major hypotheses, right? Your blood sugar is high, you go to the doctor, he says stop eating carbs, right? Don't have your carbs anymore. You know, depending on where your doctor's at, maybe it's a Mediterranean diet, but in general, there's the idea that we hear a lot in social media. It's been more prevalent is just don't have carbs, don't eat sugar. That's what's causing diabetes. So let's actually look at the U.S. data here. So that was the U.S. data for obesity. Let's see the relationships with the U.S. data for diabetes.
Great. So yeah, here that is, Mike. And I won't go through the sugar consumption numbers here again, but you can see that diabetes again was 0.0028% in 1890. And you can see that our latest numbers in 2023 was 15.8%. This is where I got that number, 5,643 fold increase in diabetes. And look at this. You can see we were only 3%. What was it? 2.97%, I think, in 1990, right around 1990.
Yeah.
Right. And we've had this almost just vertical climb in diabetes, again, from about 3% to 15.8% in the last 30, some years since 1993. So about 32 years, we've had this enormous increase. Well, most of that time, sugar's either been, flat. It's at least since 1999 or 2003, sugar has been on the downward trend. And before that, it was, overall, we haven't had much change, right?
Because
So
most of the change had started from 1822 to early 1920s, right? So from 1920
exactly.
until the early 2000s or mid 2000s, the data up to where the data we have, there hasn't really been much change in that sugar consumption.
Yeah, and here that is, Mike, supporting what you just said. But so it's back to the exact same data I showed before on sugar, but now with diabetes in here. So again, yeah, 473 calories worth of sugar consumption in 1922, 497 calories in 1987. But during that exact same time frame, diabetes 0.09% in 1922, 2.6% in 1987. So during this period, sugar increased 5%, diabetes increased 2,800%. That's 29-fold, again, over a 65-year period of time.
So
So
there's not really a relationship, is what you're saying.
there's no relationship. There's
Yeah.
no relationship.
And I do want to, I think this is a good point here because we talked about this because you had mentioned to me that people always are saying, people are always saying, well, then Chris, are you telling me that I should just go eat, like have a Slurpee or smash table sugar or something like this? And I don't think that's not what you're saying. That's not what I'm saying. It's just saying
Right.
we're not really seeing this as the prime driver. So this hyper fear and awareness that sugar is causing diabetes or obesity or something like this, there's not really strong relationships to show that from the food consumption data that we have, and even in studies in general, we're not really seeing that be a primary driver, from a clinical perspective. So it's not a call to then go completely to the other side and be like, yeah, I'm just gonna sugar diet it up, and just smash tons and tons of sugar. But at the same time, we're not on this other side saying sugar is absolutely evil and the cause of all these problems. And I think this is important because if we want to get people better, we need to know what the true problem is. We don't want to go on wild goose chases and start adjusting things in our diets that aren't fundamentally the problem. If you had to choose between a banana or a Slurpee, obviously the banana wins. There's no question about that. And I think we both agree with that. So I want to make that clear, and I wanted to give you the opportunity to say that here, so because I know that you get mischaracterized a lot.
Yes, I do get mischaracterized a lot, and I will. So yeah, probably we need a couple of opportunities in this podcast alone to say, um, uh, I'm going to, buttress what you just said. I have been presenting to audiences and conferences since 2016, so for 9 years now,
Yep.
and every single time I have said we should try to reduce or I say try to eliminate seed oils, industrial seed oils, which is most of the vegetable oils, but reduce or eliminate refined flours and refined sugars. And so I don't, even though this evidence is showing that sugar is not the fault of this, it doesn't appear to be. Sugar is a nutrient deficient food. And I know one thing, Weston A. Price's research in the 1930s was powerful evidence that refined sugars and refined flours contributed to degenerative disease. But there was very little obesity or diabetes. He didn't even look at obesity or diabetes back then because it wasn't hardly even an issue. But the
Yep.
seed oil consumption around the world in the 1930s was extremely low. It was mostly high in the United States and United Kingdom and starting to spread throughout Europe. But sugar consumption and refined flours were already very high because refined flours entered the global food supply in 1880, and
Yep.
so that's been a big problem. So yes, I'll say it over again. I don't eat sugar hardly at all. I do eat honey and maple syrup,
Yep.
and that's primarily where I would get any of my sugar and occasional dessert, but I don't have much sugar. It's a
Yeah.
nutrient deficient food.
Okay. So we talked about sugars for diabetes, and I just this one we could just do quick as well. But it's like, what about carbohydrates? Do carbohydrates track at all with diabetes? And
Yeah,
I, like
great.
this could be like breads, pastas, stuff like this.
Right. Well, so as one might imagine, since we already saw the carbohydrate data for obesity, here's carbohydrates, which is the exact same curve on the carbohydrate consumption. It has to be, right, for the United States from 1909 to 2009. But here's the relationship with diabetes. And again, you can see that we've had this, again, 5,643 fold increase in diabetes, while the carbohydrates during a century from 1909 to 2009 actually went slightly down, but I would just call it flat. I would call that flat. It's 500 grams in 1909 versus about 480 grams, I think, is the number in 2009.
Yeah. So basically, minimal change in carbohydrate consumption and a hockey stick on the graph here for diabetes in terms of
Right.
the incidence prevalence of diabetes in the U.S. Okay, so we know carbohydrates and sugars aren't tracking. I guess we are going to say, is there any other dietary factor that does track with diabetes? But I think we know what that is. And then the other thing I want to, I guess, ask you as well, because I think everybody knows at this point we're going to show that's in relationship with diabetes. But in our last podcast, I think you had mentioned that diabetes was actually increasing while sugar consumption and was on the decline. So I also want to go through that if you have the opportunity, and we'll look at some of the other factors that are triggering or corroborating with the increase in diabetes here.
Right. So here is that evidence, Mike, and you can see that again, this is sugar and vegetable oil consumption versus diabetes from 1870 to 2016. With the sugar, this just shows you the time frame that we've looked at. Here's the here's the. I'll just point out some interesting things here. Again, in 1935, I just picked a lower point. Around that time for sugar consumption. It was 440 calories in 1935. That's per person per day. And yet, diabetes was 0.37%, or 1 in 270 people.
Yeah.
And then, so that's 1935. 2016, sugar consumption is 526 calories, or 24% of calories. It's actually 1.5% more in terms of percentage of calories, but it's hardly, it's a very small change overall, right? and yet diabetes affects 1 in 8 people. So again, diabetes affected 1 in 270 people back in 1935, and 1 in 8 people here in 2015, right? And the sugar consumption is very little different. It's and very, very similar in terms of the percentage. So now here, if we go back to that 65-year period, which from 1922 to 1987, we see the same thing that we did with obesity. Is that here diabetes was 0.09% in 1922, 2.6% in 1987. So during this period, 1922 to 1987, sugar up 5%, vegetables up 605%. Those numbers haven't changed. Of course, diabetes up at 2,800% during that period alone. And if we look at this, is diabetes just since 1991 was 2.97%, all the way to 13% by 2015, I believe, right there. But look at this. While the sugar is on the decline after right around 2000. Sugar's on the decline. And again, by any data set, at least by 2003, sugar is on the decline. So while diabetes has had the sharpest increase in prevalence in the United States, we've seen sugar on the decline.
So basically, sugar consumption's dropping. Diabetes is again hockey sticking, going up considerably in the U.S. At least in the early to mid 2000s. So we're again like relationship with sugar consumption and diabetes not so strong. Not only in this time frame where you basically see a inverse relationship, right? So lower sugar, higher diabetes, but also across time in the 20th century, we didn't really see, like, we had seen almost flat sugar consumption, yet diabetes is still increasing. And what tracks better with this is actually vegetable oil consumption.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, vegetable oil consumption just tracks. It's lockstep correlation.
Okay.
It's
And so,
it's just almost a 1-for-1. I mean, it tracks very, very, very well, especially as again, as you get to the higher levels, you see a really strong correlation. Yeah, you see a very, very strong correlation.
so basically, as vegetable oil consumption increases significantly, diabetes also tends to increase significantly, just like obesity.
Absolutely.
Okay. So I guess
Absolutely.
the nice thing, or the thing about this, is we just looked at the US, right?
Right.
And that's pretty strong data for the US. But I would say if there was other countries who had a similar relationship, then that data would be even stronger. So can you tell me about these other countries, these 17 or I guess 16 other countries that you have data on that we can discuss and see some of the relationships in these other circumstances?
Yes, exactly. So, a colleague friend of mine sent me this article that I'll show it, um, or part of it later, but it was showing obesity climbing in 17 countries, but with one of them, France was dropping. And this was last summer. And so I thought, I've got to figure out what's going on with not just France, but all of these countries. So I started working on this data. And this is a mountain of work and evidence to work on. But anyway, this is obesity in the 17 countries, and we'll show France later. But this is Egypt, United States, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, Argentina, South Africa, Australia, Brazil, United Kingdom, Russia, Morocco, Germany, Italy, Sweden, China, India, and Japan. And you can see from 1990 to 2022, every single one of these 17 countries, which represent more than half the world's population, obesity is climbing, and it's they're practically all going up at the same rate. And then you can see, so I got diabetes data. And by the way, again, with all of this food consumption data, it's all coming from the FAO. This obesity and diabetes data comes from the World Health Organization's Global Health Observatory. So anybody can go into these databases. It's not easy to work with the FAO, all right? It's a challenge to get used to that. But it's available for anybody to get this data. So anybody can confirm all of these numbers. Here's the diabetes for those 17 countries. And you can see they're also all up since 1990, from 1990 to 2022. You had a couple of them that swung upwards and then came back down. But overall, the trend for all of them is up.
Okay, so we basically have the data on obesity and diabetes. So similar trends to the US, an increase, maybe not as much as an increase in the US as some countries. Maybe some countries have more of an increase in the US. But then do these data sets also show sugar, carbohydrate consumption, all of this type of stuff?
Yes. Yes. So that's what I wanted to do. So I got the sugar consumption data from the FAO. And I decided to go back to 1961 to 2022 because they've got data that far. So the data doesn't go back any farther than 1961. But look at this for the 17 countries. And folks, this is a mountain of data that it takes to for all of this to be presented on a graph. But anyway, you can see that for most of the countries, the sugar consumption hasn't really changed very much since 1961. We'll get into the details momentarily. Here is 1990 to 2022, and you can see that it's mostly flat, if not a little bit down. Again, this is sugar consumption per capita per day, all converted into an amount per year, and then for all 17 countries graphed year by year, so you can see exactly what the data looks like. Now, it's hard to see with all these going up and down. I like to sometimes in that scenario look at the sugar trend. So the sugar trend, you just get the beginning and ending point. And you can see that about half of these are the sugar is going up, and the other, maybe roughly the other half, I won't get into nitty gritty, but they're going down. Sugar consumption is going down. And that's since 1961. But if so let's zoom in from 1990 to 2022, and you can see that the preponderance are going down because we've been told for a long time sugar consumption is not good. I agree with that. I mean, I recommend, not adding very much granulated sugar. But anyway, so we'll convert all that into one graph, one line. So we took all 17 countries' data, you put it all together, and you get an amount per day. Well, if you go back to 1961, that amount was 305 calories per person per day back in 1961. That peaked in 1980 at 381 calories a day. And now you see that in general, it's dropping. And by 2022, sugar consumption for these 17 countries is actually down to 338 calories a day. So again, we're 381 calories in 1980, 338 calories in 2022. And again, this is for all 17 countries. And we can see that decline, right?
But obesity and diabetes for almost all of those countries are actually on the increase from our previous graphs, just as a reminder for the people listening.
Yes, and I'm going to give the numbers later. I'm going to show you that obesity and diabetes doubled, but we'll get to that.
Okay, so what about carbs then? So we looked at sugar. Is it the same with carbs?
Yeah, so I couldn't wait to get into to dig into that either. Way back, months ago when I was working on all this data. So here's where we are. Again, data comes from the FAO, and you can see and I didn't go back to 1961. Again, this is it's a mountain of work to do this, but I went back to 1990, and you can see here's the carb consumption year by year for each of those 17 countries, and you can see that they're mostly flat. Wouldn't you call that pretty flat, Mike?
I would say it's pretty flat overall, but I think it's nice that you actually put all the data points on the graphs. You can see that there is actually variation in consumption, which I think is more fair. But on average, it looks pretty flat for most countries.
Right. Yeah, and here's the carb trends for those 17 countries. And again, you see that some are up and some are down, but overall, they don't change very much. So now we'll take all that data, again, 17 countries representing more than half of the world's population, and put it into one carbohydrate consumption. And look at that. It's virtually flat. You see almost no change at all from 1990 to 2022 overall, while obesity and diabetes, and I'll get to the exact numbers, but they more than doubled during this period alone.
So basically, again, not really a strong relationship between carbohydrate consumption and obesity and diabetes in the sense that the carbs are flat, yet obesity and diabetes continue to go up.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, there's almost no correlation at all.
Okay. So I think we already know where the next thing is going here. Is there something that does track with these disease processes?
There absolutely is, and here it is. Look at the vegetable oil consumption for these 17 countries, and you can see, and I've got this data from 1961 to 2022, and look at that. You can see that every single one of them is way, way up. Every single one. And then we zoom in, just as from 1990 to 2022, and you can still see that every single one of them is up after not from 1990 to 2022. And if you look at here's the trends, now you can really see that they're all up between 1961 and 2022, every single one of them. And here is vegetable oil trends from 1990 to 2022. You can see every single one is up. So I converted that into just one graph line. I should say I've got a team that helps me with some of this. But here's the vegetable oil consumption from 1961 to 2022. And in 1961, it averaged 157 calories per day. And that tripled, essentially, or almost tripled to 449 calories by 2022. And again, this is the average for these 17 countries, again, tripled. And so here, this is the big kahuna. This is all of them. Everything we've looked at together, you can see, again, just from 1990 to 2022 for these 17 countries, you can see obesity climbed from 11.6% in 1990 to 25.5%. So it more than doubled. Diabetes climbed from elevated from 6.8% in 1990 to 13.7% in 2022. It also more than doubled, while the sugar declined from 366 calories down to 338 calories, and the vegetable oil elevated from 317 calories in 1990 to 449 calories in 2022.
Okay, so basically, sugar and carbohydrates are flat. Obesity and diabetes are more than doubling from 1990 to 2022. And then vegetable oil consumption is going up like 1.5 times in closer correlation with obesity and diabetes than the sugar or the carbohydrates. So at the minimum, we don't really see any relationship between sugars or carbohydrates. And we do see a potential relationship here between vegetable oil consumption and obesity and diabetes. And again, this isn't not now we're not even looking, I guess the US is included in here, but we're also looking at 16 other countries and still seeing the same relationships.
Right. Exactly. And I should have put the graph in here that also had carbs on this same graph, but we've seen that the carbs were flat for these 27 countries during that time.
Okay. So I guess the one thing here though, and this is I'd say probably one of the biggest critiques that I've seen people make in the comment section of our last video or in other videos that you've done. So they're like, okay, Chris, this is great. This research is great. Like there's a lot of great information here, but these are just correlations. So can you speak to that a little bit in terms of, why are we able to actually look at this correlational data and draw some degree of conclusions from it? Don't we need to do randomized controlled trials or something like this instead of doing just the correlational data? What are your thoughts on this? Because this is something that I see in the comments quite a bit.
Right. And that's a good question and a good observation, perhaps to make, or at least a question. And so this is the thing that this I might be on my high horse here, Mike, for a moment, because this is something that kind of trips my trigger. Because this, I want to present this, that this is the usual argument that we see today, that, well, we have our observational studies like epidemiology, and from that we can make observations, from that formulate hypotheses, and from those hypotheses then we can design a randomized controlled clinical trial to test the hypothesis or hypotheses, run the experiment, and then from that deduce facts. And I've got a question mark over here by the facts, because a lot of these facts are incorrect, because excuse me, because of the fact that you've made incorrect assumptions, and you may have not accounted for confounding variables. And there's so many reasons why this is not necessarily always the best way to go. So on the contrary, if you use observational studies, for example, I think these have immense power. And in most cases, I will argue that they're more powerful. But here's how they work. So you take observational studies like epidemiology, and you've got this bold and powerful long-term evidence like I just presented. This evidence can go back 150 years or whatever, could go back, decades or centuries. Then you can put, if you need to, apply data analytics, which we're going to get to. And then from this, draw these what I would call bold conclusions. So if you think about, so what's really happened in the last, since 1950, is there's been this extraordinary belief system that you must have a randomized controlled clinical trial to learn anything. And this is so incredibly false. For example, we didn't need randomized controlled trials to prove that smoking causes lung cancer, asbestos causes mesothelioma, radiation caused cancer. For example, we learned that, that one right there from the atomic bombs, that when we bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, for example. That lead causes brain damage in children, from children who ate paint chips with lead, for example. That hypertension causes stroke and heart disease. Alcohol abuse causes liver cirrhosis. We don't need randomized controlled trials to prove that parachutes save lives when people jump from planes. I mean, we've gotten to the point that I would say to people, do you think you need a randomized controlled clinical trial to prove that people who jump out of airplanes are more likely to survive if they use a parachute, deploy a parachute? I mean, people think they can't learn anything without a randomized controlled trial. This is born out of big pharma, because in big pharma you've got these little tiny differences, and so you need these huge studies that last, thousands of people to track little tiny differences. But anyway, let me go on. So, do we need an RCT to prove that seat belts save lives in car crashes? Do we need to crash people in cars in a randomized way to prove it? Or that helmets prevent head injury in motorcycle and bike accidents, life jackets prevent drowning? No, we don't need or use RCTs for any of this. Now, so again, what I would argue is that what a lot of the work that I do is retrospective observational epidemiological evidence. Why? Because it captures real world evidence. RWE is what's being called in the research now. So let me give you some examples, and I'll make this quick, Mike. But chronic disease is nearly impossible to capture in these RCCTs. So, for example, the first question I would say to all of us, to our audience, all of us, is, well, what's the incubation period of most of the diseases that we're so concerned about? Coronary heart disease, stroke, midlife cancers, Alzheimer's disease, macular degeneration. Do we see these diseases in people under 40? Almost never, right? But yet these people, so that I would say, that the driver of most all of these diseases is processed foods. And, people, are born, and within months, often they're consuming processed foods, and they consume those for the rest of their life, um, huge amounts, right? Americans, as of 2009, were consuming 63% highly ultra processed foods, and yet, it took them till their 40s or 50s or 60s to develop heart attacks, strokes, cancers, and Alzheimer's and macular degeneration, for example. So only observational studies can capture this kind of evidence. I mean, when's the last time, Mike, that we saw diabetes increasing during a randomized controlled trial? We don't see it, right?
Yeah.
Most of these randomized controlled trials have lasted no more than a few years. Most of them are just a few weeks or a few months. And I'm just going to hit a couple more highlights here.
So just a quick question, really quick.
Yeah.
So, or just, I guess, points of clarification. So basically what you're saying is the RCTs are, because most of them aren't really run for that long, right? Because extremely expensive, time consuming to actually run them. You can't really set up an appropriate RCT to figure out what the underlying causes of these disease processes are, because they take decades to unfold, and there's so many variables that may play into them in terms of different lifestyle factors that people are having, that it'd be difficult to control all of the confounders in any reasonable sense. So with that said, you actually have to look at some of the epidemiologic data, or some of the relationship, like basically see some of this correlational data in a retrospective fashion to try to parse out which components have the highest signal versus noise in terms of driving some of these disease processes. So basically what you're saying is it's not that RCTs are bad studies to run, but it's that inherently because of how they're set up and because of the resourcing components that are required for them to work effectively, it would be improbable that you're going to actually realistically run an RCT to actually figure out what these driving components are for these disease processes. Again, because of how long it takes for them to unfold, and because of we're showing seed oils have a strong relationship with these things. But as you talk about in your book, and as we've talked about, they are multifactorial. There's multiple processes that go into driving these that drive into these factors, with diet being a huge one, including multiple elements of the diet, right? Which is why, even though sugar doesn't seem to be a driver of the chronic diseases, it's not really recommended to still have high amounts of white flour or high amounts of refined sugar in the diet, because maybe it doesn't create some of the same levels of cellular dysfunction of seed oils or vegetable oils, but it's still extremely nutrient deficient. So you have a circumstance now where you develop nutrient deficiencies over time, which could still lead to different disease processes or make you more susceptible to certain infections, like we saw with some of the work from Weston A. Price and things like this. So this is the perspective, or this is the am I clarifying that well? Am I condensing that your point of view well, not mischaracterizing it?
Absolutely, Mike. Yeah. Randomized controlled trials are fine, but how are you? Well, first of all, let me just say this: there's never been a single randomized controlled trial that has been done with seed oils that was properly set up and well controlled. Not one that even came close. Why? First of all, since the half-life of, let's just call them seed oils, in the body, or the fatty acids in the body, is 600 to 680 days. That's 2 years basically. It takes 3 years to turn over all the fatty acids in the body. 3 years. That means that, let's say you want to compare vegetable oils to just a 0% vegetable oil diet, right?
Yep.
Let's say you want to do that. The first thing you need to do is you need to have a run-in period, 3 years. That means neither group, or the groups that are going to go into your study, none of them get any vegetable oils at all for 3 years. You can get all of their fatty acids down to an ancestral level, right? Now how are you going to do that? You're going to have to put the people into a metabolic ward to accomplish that. That means they have to live inside of like a prison where all their foods are made. Because if they leave and they go eat, go eat French fries, that, you're ruining your study, right?
Yep.
Then you can, okay, 3 years later, now you start the actual experiment. You put the, one group, you randomize them, put one group on seed oils, one group without. Now you follow them. Okay. Let's say you're interested in heart disease, coronary heart disease. Well, you probably need 20, 30, 40 years to do it. Right.
Yep.
And you need longer than that with Alzheimer's. And you need, you're going to get answers. You can get answers with diabetes and obesity a lot quicker. Maybe that would only take a few months to a couple of years once you've set up the study right and you've done the washout period. Right. So I'm not opposed to any of these, but there's never been one done, not one that meets these kind of criteria. So, but with epidemiology, you leverage the power of this. You're studying massive populations over tens or hundreds of years, just like I've shown here. I mean, I've shown you today, that obesity has risen 35-fold. If you run an RCT, you're going to be running it maybe for a few weeks or a few months. And the RCTs where they do control the diets, there's usually only dozens, maybe a few hundred participants. These studies they're underpowered. They're going to have a lot of false negatives, spurious findings. So epidemiology looks at real world populations. The people are living their normal lives. They're consuming their own diet. They're exercising or not, smoking or not. Whereas the gold standard in RCTs examines, again, as I mentioned, maybe a dozen or a few dozen participants in most cases locked up in a metabolic ward, for up to 6 months or so. And the longest study I've ever seen that completely controlled diets in people was the Minnesota starvation experiment. I think it was completed in 1943, and it ran for about a year. So it's extremely difficult and extremely expensive. And in many cases, it would be considered unethical to do some of these studies, in a randomized controlled type of way. Now, let me just say one last thing on this, Micah, and it's this. I even looked at, here's the evidence in medicine. So the vast majority, about 80 to 90% of what we know and practice in medicine is based on observational evidence. Analyses confirm that only about 10 to 20% of medical recommendations are supported by RCCTs. For example, in 2009, there was this review in the British Medical Journal, and they found that just 11% of cardiology guidelines were based on randomized controlled trials. That same review found that of more than 3,000 surgical procedures, only 11% were supported by at least one randomized controlled trial. I'm a surgeon. I'm an eye surgeon, an ophthalmologist, but I spent my career in that. Cataract surgery. It's the number one performed surgical procedure in the world. There's never been a single randomized controlled trial. Why? Because we observe like I could tell my patients confidently, you have a 99.6% chance, I think, was something like that of having visual improvement with cataract surgery in my hands. If you have a black cataract, a patient is blind. This happens in the third world all the time. Patients that haven't seen their grandchildren, right? And you take out one cataract, put in a lens implant, and that day or the next day, they're seeing their grandkids' faces for the first time sometimes. Do you need a randomized controlled trial to prove that works? It's the same thing with
Would it
appendectomy.
be even ethical, right? It's going to be
It's
like,
not-
well,
it's
you
not
guys
ethical.
are going to get it and you guys aren't going to get it.
Right. Yeah, it's not ethical. It'd be the same thing with appendectomy, for example, or anything that threatens somebody's life. You can't, we know that the surgery saves, helps people and saves lives. So last thing I'll say on this is there's a growing body of global leaders in epidemiology, evidence-based medicine, and health policy. They're all arguing that observational real-world evidence trumps randomized controlled trials in many domains. So do I think these should replace RCTs? Absolutely not. But used together, I think we need to use all of them. We use them together. But RCTs have extreme limitations. So do observational studies. Let's use them together. And I think I think they both can be powerful.
So basically, I mean, the way I see it when I look at some of the different studies is you have to use the right or the different types of studies. You have to use the right tool for the right job, right? You don't hammer screws into the wall, you hammer nails into the wall. So depending on the problem or question at hand, certain like certain study setups or designs are going to be better than others. And basically, your hypothesis here is that for chronic disease processes that take decades to unfold and are potentially largely driven by like chronically terrible food consumption patterns, the best way to actually get a sense of what's going on and understand how things are being adjusted, or like to just get like a big population wide understanding, is to look at the data sets that you're looking at, because you really can't do it with an RCT, or at
Right.
least given the resources and capabilities that we have right now, there's like zero shot that we're going to have a 3-year run-in period, then have the two different groups for a number of decades consume. One group gets like low linoleic acid or low omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acid diet to set to ancestral levels, and then the other group just gets like basically as much seed oil, vegetable oil consumption as possible with high amounts of linoleic acid or omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids. You run that for decades, and then you see what happens. It just, I mean, you couldn't do that. No, the 3-year period is going to be impossible to obtain. And then on top of that, you have a circumstance where if one of those groups does do worse, and there's a pretty good idea that like one is going to do worse, then it would be unethical. Not to mention that like having somebody run a relatively standard diet for decades would be probably what is not going to happen. Like the probability that you get enough people to have the study powered enough for that to occur is probably extremely small. So it's just not going to, you have to use some other tool to get this understanding. And that the tool that we're using is like, look, I have this data on 4.5 billion people almost. And I have the data on their food consumption patterns, or the available food from economic data. And then I can see like what tracks with these disease processes the best, combing through all of that data to try to find where you see the strongest relationships, and then try to make assessments there on top of. And the other thing, which we're going to get into in another podcast, but also looking at what were previous peoples or current peoples who don't have any of those diseases, what are they doing in comparison, which that was Weston A. Price's idea. And then you're taking that to another level with all the statistical data that you're running here. But then also another piece I will get into right now is there a population that actually has, an opposite relationship, or from what we're seeing with these other countries, right? So we have 16 countries where seed oils or vegetable oils go up, and so does diabetes and obesity. But do we see the opposite occur? Do we have a country where seed oil consumption goes down, and so do these disease processes?
Yes, this is what I was alluding to before, that my friend, colleague that sent me this article, and this is it. And here's the title: How is France dodging the global obesity trend? And this is the article that I said got me thinking. It helped me to decide to do this research, was because he presented this graph that obesity is climbing in, and it's actually, this is a total of 18 countries on this one, Mike.
Yep.
With only the one, France. So I took France out of the previous analysis because I wanted to look at all these other 17. But look at this. France, from about 2004, I think it is, all the way to 2022 or something, their obesity is on the decline. And this is what made me think, I've got to look at this. Like, this is so important. And so I dug and dug, and this took months to get all this together and get evidence from France on this. But so here it is. And this data, the food consumption data, of course, comes from the FAO. And here's look at obesity in France. Look how it's climbed since, this is back here in 1980, and it peaked here in 2005, I think. Then look at this. Look how it's dropped all the way to 2022. But look at the vegetable oil consumption right here, right about the exact same time these peak together, approximately. And you see the vegetable oil declining all the rest of this time, right in line with the obesity. This is the only country I've seen this. Like, there's no other country where for a decade or beyond, actually, that vegetable oils is on the decline. Why? People have said to me, why is France consuming less vegetable oil? And I don't really know, but they're
That's what
going
Ethan
back to their
asked too.
roots.
Ethan asked me
They're,
too. He's like, "Why are they having less vegetable oil?" I was like, "I
I
don't
don't
know.
know.
Butter
I
tastes
looked,
better."
yeah, I looked around to see, was there a recommendation from their government? And I don't know, but I didn't find it. Maybe some of the authorities in France would know. But look at this. Here's the interesting part too is their sugar consumption is flat.
Yeah.
Look at that. You can see that they're not consuming really more or less sugar while their obesity declined, right? So then I looked at the carbohydrates and look at this. Carbohydrates, like the other 17 countries,
Flat.
they're flat,
Yep.
right? I mean, everybody around the world loves to consume carbs, like you and I do, Mike.
Yep.
Like, I am
And
not going to give those up,
most
right?
clients is the same thing. They even if they've done keto and carnivore, 'cause most people I work with have done low carb, keto, carnivore stuff like this. What so you
Yeah.
go through the period you don't have carbs, and then when you come out of that period and you have carbs again, most people are like, "I'm just not like I don't want to go back. I'm just not going back. Like I want to keep carbs in my diet." So I'm not surprised that the rest of the world feels about the same way.
They do. They do. Absolutely. I mean, the evidence proves it. So look at this. The carbs are completely flat. This is from 1961 all the way to 2022. Look at that. They could not be any more flat, really. So there's no relationship between carbohydrates and obesity in France. And look at this. So then I got this data and I put all together, but it was diabetes. So here's the diabetes prevalence in France, and look at that going down. So you can see where it was. I don't have the exact numbers on here, but there's a substantial decrease. Here's the prevalence on the x-axis over here in the percentage. So you can see they were around 10% in 2008, and they dropped to it's 5 point something percent over here. Well, they got all the way down to
Looks like
under,
less than 3 almost.
yeah, it was around 3%, and then they've come back up. But nevertheless, we can see that the trend is from about 10% down to about 5.5%. So a really substantial drop in their diabetes. Again, of course, the vegetable oil in alignment with their drop in vegetable oil. And here I just drug that out. I had my Excel experts spread this data out over a shorter period of time so we could see it better. And here you can see that the drop in the diabetes and obesity would they track together with the drop in vegetable oil. And here is the carbohydrates in a shorter time frame, and you can see there's a drop in diabetes, no drop in carbohydrates
Yep.
overall. During that time, you can see that's, if anything, the carbohydrates are going up overall while the diabetes goes down in France. So it's the only country in the world, Mike, that I know of where both obesity and diabetes have declined for an entire decade. And this occurred precisely during a drop in vegetable oil consumption with no overall decline in sugar or carbohydrate consumption.
So basically you have 16 countries where increase in vegetable oil consumption directly correlates with obesity and diabetes. Carbs and sugar don't correlate really at all. And then you have one country where you see a decrease in vegetable oil consumption with a concomitant decrease in diabetes and obesity. So you're
Right.
seeing both sides of the relationships. Um, Now I want to segue here because we looked at the US and we looked at these 16 other countries, but you actually took this
17.
data. Well, seven, because the U.S. was in that 17 countries, right?
Yeah. Well, okay. I see what you're saying. Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah. Go
so
ahead.
you have the
Go ahead.
17 countries data, which include the U.S. Then you have the other U.S. data that you looked at,
Hmm.
and you actually did a research project. You hired a statistician to
Yep.
run an was it a regression analysis on this
Yes.
data
Yes.
of 4.5 billion people. So can you walk us through that? Because the results were pretty interesting, especially when you first showed me it, when you first sent me the presentation. I was like, wow, this is crazy.
Yeah. This is exciting. Well, at least for a geek like me who finds this exciting. But anyway, so this is. I'm not going to go through all of the regression analysis, but what this is there's so the 17 countries that I just we just went through. I sent all this to this colleague, Eugene Antipov, PhD. He's a data analytics scientist. He's a professor in Dubai, United Arab Emirates. And I asked him to do I'm not a, I'm a data junkie, but I'm not a data analyst, right? I don't have a background, a strong background in that, other than what I got in college and medical school. But anyway, so here's how he reported this. First of all, this is what he put as the data and sample description. So I want to present this quickly. So he says the data set includes 559 country year observations covering 17 countries over the period 1990 to 2022. Each country is observed for 33 years. Dietary variables are measured in kilocalories per person per day. Outcomes represent the percentage of adults diagnosed with obesity and diabetes. Countries included Argentina, Australia, Brazil, China, Egypt, Germany. I won't name them all again. The total population for the 17 countries assessed in 22 was approximately 4.31 billion people, representing about 53.9% of the world's population that year. Here's the data sources for the food. We've gone over that. That's FAO stat. So I won't go through that again.
I want to just put a clarification for people listening here, because I actually think
Sure.
it's really interesting. So the 559 country year observations was the 17 countries by the 33 years, and I think there was like one country, Russia, you say on here, was missing like data for 2 years or 3 years or something like this. But basically, this is like looking at this food consumption data over the course of these 17 countries for a cumulative total of 559 years. And
Right.
the total population that we looked at here, this was 4.31 billion people. So half the world's population is what you're looking at with this data set. So a massive, massive data set here across multiple different countries with, multiple different eating patterns, cultures, lifestyles, climates, etc. And then you're looking at these dietary relationships to see what's going on in terms of the disease process, how these things track, for example, obesity or diabetes, with some of these different dietary components, like some of the ones that people claim are the biggest drivers of obesity or diabetes, right? So carbohydrates, sugars, etc. So I want to give that frame there because it's a huge data set. It counts for quite a bit of time, and it covers multiple different populations across the world. So it's quite a crazy. It's like if Weston A. Price was alive right now, this would be like basically his dream, is to have information like this, to be able to
Yeah.
see the trends instead of just like individual groups pre and post.
Yeah. And of course, all the work that I do, since 2013, all of my work, Mike, I see it through the lens of Weston A. Price. And yeah, it would be a dream come true for him to have data and data analytics like this. I am so fortunate that through our foundations, we can hire experts like Eugene Antipov, PhD, that did the work I'm about to present to you. Just extraordinary. I mean, it's extraordinary what the capacity, the potential we have to get data like this. Like I said, these are mountains and mountains of data that I can't even fathom how many people around the world worked on this, for their whole lives to get this kind of data that we can present here in a few minutes. Okay, all the data, all the evidence for the 17 countries on obesity and diabetes came from the World Health Organization. I mentioned that. So here's how Dr. Eugene Antipov set up this regression analysis. So first of all, regression analysis, for those who don't know, it's basically is sort of a way to look at how all different variables move in relation to one another, and it's a way to hold variables constant, which some of this data kind of does that by itself. For example, the carbs not changing very much, but it's really, this is why I decided to show all of those graphs with the, all of the squiggly lines, everything moving up and down, and you've got countries where sugar's going down, sugar's going up. You take all that. And so in this regression analysis, you can look at each country and you can say, okay, so this country, obesity is moving up, at the same time that vegetable oils are going up, but maybe sugar is going down in that country and sugar's going, it's the opposite in another country, let's say. That way you can take it all together. So he set up, Dr. Antipov set up these models. This is sort of how it looks, and Mike helped me simplify this. You did, Mike, of course, but this is basically for the audience. So in the first model, you're just looking at vegetable oil versus obesity. And then all these are just versus obesity, okay? In the second model, it's sugar versus vegetable oil. Third model, you add in carbs versus vegetable oil, no sugar. And then the fourth model, he looked at vegetable oil versus sugar versus carbs. So they're all three of them. And then the fifth model, you have all of those, vegetable oil, sugar, and carbs, and the population size to take in to see if does a large population or whatever make any difference. So here's the bottom line. Here's what Dr. Antipov found in these models, that in the first model, we see that we're just going to give you the bottom line here, which is how did obesity change in relation to vegetable oil? So per 100 kilocalorie increase per day, there was a 6.3% increase in obesity on average in any country. All right. Now you can see when he added in sugar for the second model of vegetable oil and sugar, it made almost no difference, 6.2%. Actually, it was slightly down. When he looked at vegetable oil and carbohydrates, 6.3% obesity change per 100 calorie increase in vegetable oil. He looks at all of these together. Again, no change. And then finally, adding in population, still 6%. So in every scenario, you can see that the vegetable oil alone explains almost all the variations, the way the statisticians would put it, in the outcome, the obesity. All right. And in every single one of these models, the significance, statistically significant at p less than 0.001. That means there's less than a 1 in 1,000 chance that you could get these numbers, that these numbers could come out like this by chance alone. So
that's 99.9% of the chance was because of the vegetable oil in this relationship, correct?
Exactly.
Basically what you're saying, there's a 99.9% chance that this was due to vegetable oil, that for every 100 calorie increase in vegetable oils, there's somewhere between a 6 to 6.3% increase in obesity, specifically in these models. And then we'll talk about, you're going to show us afterwards, sugars versus carbohydrates, etc.
Right. Yeah. So a 6 to 6.3% increase in obesity in relation to 100 kilocalorie increase in vegetable oil, and it's independent of sugar or carbohydrate consumption. This is the single strongest and most consistent predictor of obesity that we've observed in any population evidence so far. Again, and this is a massive database. So if we let's look at sugar if we put sugar into this scenario, which was been model number 2, right?
Yep.
In this analysis, we see as sugar increases by 100 kilocalories, obesity in model 2 went down 1.6%, and in model 4, obesity went down 2.8%, and in model 5, obesity went down 1.9%. Only one of these was statistically significant. This one at 2.8% drop. But the bottom line is what we're saying here is that sugar, as sugar went up, if anything, obesity went down. It's barely statistically significant, only in one of these models.
Basically, you're saying at best, there's really no relationship looking at all this data together with sugar and obesity. And or I'd say at worst, there's no relationship. And at best, there is actually a decrease with increasing consumption of sugar. And I just want to point out for people listening or watching that the reason that we're only showing model 2, 4, and 5 is because those are the models that incorporated sugar. Model 1 was just vegetable oil. Model 3 was just carbs versus vegetable oil. So that's why we only have the 3 models there, because we weren't actually testing sugar in those models. Or I wasn't doing this, but the way that we're reporting it in the presentation, or that Chris is reporting it in the presentation, is only those 3 models because of the change, because sugar wasn't in models 1 and in model 3.
Right. And so we'll go on. So this is in this is regarding carbohydrates and obesity in the same models, but here, so again, just as Mike pointed out, we were pointing at the models that looked at sugar. Now these 3 models, 3, 4, and 5, they include carbohydrates, and you can see this carbs coefficient is really, really low. I'll get to what that means in a minute, but I want to show you here on the far right that the significance that was not statistically significant. So here, if we make this into something that's interpretable by us normal people, obesity change per 100 kilocalories in model 2 plus 0.4%, in model 4 plus 1.1%, and plus model 5 plus 0.4%. This is the obesity increase per 100 kilocalories increase. Again, none of these are statistically significant. So this strongly suggests that really there's no relationship between carbohydrates and obesity. None of these are statistically significant differences. So here's the way that Dr. Antipov wrote this. This is his words. Carbohydrate consumption showed a very weak and inconsistent association with obesity across all 3 models. Even when carbohydrates were increased by 100 kilocalories per person per day, obesity prevalence rose by less than 1 percentage point, and the results were not statistically significant. This strongly suggests that carbohydrates, like sugar, do not appear to be a key driver of obesity when vegetable oil is included in the analysis. That is not my words. That comes directly from Dr. Antipov.
Okay, so basically no relationship between sugar and carbohydrates. They're pretty weak on either side, only one statistically significant one for sugar. But for vegetable oil, you saw between a 6 to 6.3% increase in obesity, was a prevalence for every 100 kilocalorie increase of vegetable oils. So that's a pretty, that was the major factor that came out, and it kind of exonerates the sugar and carbohydrates here as prime drivers of these disease processes.
Sure does.
Okay, and then, so just to, like, I guess, contextualize this, what does this actually look like in turn, like on a regular daily basis? So say I was going to eat my sugar in tablespoons or add oil to my food. What does that look like for me? How much oil do I need to have on a daily basis to increase my risk or incidence or prevalence of diabetes based on this data?
Yes. So from this evidence, this is what we would glean. A little over 2 teaspoons of seed oils would, at the country level, elevate obesity by about 6% at the country level. At the same time, 2 tablespoons, a little over 2 tablespoons of sugar, could lower obesity about 2%. But again, remember that in this data, this lowering obesity, that's not statistically significant. So I would say it's most likely to have no effect. But if anything, it probably, it's been connected with lowering obesity.
Yeah. So really 2 teaspoons of seed oils per day per person, at least based in this data, would be associated with a 6% increase in obesity.
Yes, if we could apply it at the individual level, that's how I would put it. All right. So here's what I would say about what we've already covered and this in general, that right here, while no statistical model can absolutely prove cause and effect, the consistency of this relationship, even when we account for sugar, carbohydrates, and country-specific factors, strongly suggest that this link between vegetable oil and obesity is causal.
Okay. So we have the relationship between vegetable oils and obesity. And to some extent, you exonerated carbs and sugar as potentially primary drivers here. So what about diabetes? Did you run this model with diabetes?
Yes, so we sure did. And since we've gone through this and people are probably getting a little bit more comfortable with it already, I'm going to present this in just 3 steps the same way. So this is diabetes versus vegetable oil, and we've got those 5 models. But I'm just going to show you here, if we look at this, is the increase in diabetes prevalence for each 100 kilocalorie increase in vegetable oils. And you can see that it ranged from 1.9% down here in model 5 to a high of 2.5% in models 1 and 3. So that this is what you could say that and look at the probability, p less than 0.001. So you have an incredibly strong statistical model that shows that 100 kilocalorie increase in vegetable oils predictably raises diabetes in a country by about 1.9 to 2.5%. And here, if you look at sugar in these models, you can see that for the increase of 100 kilocalories in sugar, that the change in diabetes minus 0.6%, minus 1.1%, and minus 0.5%. So again, while sugar went up, diabetes went down. None of these were statistically significant. What this suggests in all 3 of these regression models is that there's really no relationship between sugar and diabetes at all. And then if we look at carbohydrates versus diabetes in these regression models, again, that's models 3, 4, and 5. Look at the change in diabetes prevalence for each 100 kilocalorie increase in carbs, 0.2%, 0.5%, and 0. So, and none of these are statistically significant. So there's a trivial increase in diabetes prevalence for each 100 kilocalorie or calorie increase in carbohydrates, but with it not being statistically significant in any of the models, what I would say again is that carbohydrates don't predict diabetes outcomes at all.
Yeah, so basically sugar and carbohydrates with this data set aren't really tracking in any way with diabetes. And then we do have the 1.9, I think it was the 2.5 or 2.6% increase in diabetes for every 100 kilocalorie increase in seed oil consumption.
Yes, exactly. So, so I would just say that data in these 17 countries, which represents 53.9% of the world's population, strongly suggest that the sugar theory of obesity and diabetes is essentially abolished if we look at industrial seed oil consumption and we account for that. So when you see these, many of these, some of these other studies that have linked sugar consumption to obesity and diabetes, they weren't factoring in this enormous confounder, and that's vegetable oil. And you have to look at that.
Yeah, and I think something that's important to point out here is that a lot of times, in a lot of circumstances, I don't think people just have straight up seed oil, right? I think a lot of the ways that I think modern people are getting seed oils is through packaged foods, which include very refined carbohydrate sources. So it's not to say, oh, if you get rid of seed oils, like everything is all good to go. It's in general, eliminating processed foods altogether will, number one, eliminate the seed oil consumption, also industrial additives and problematic components in those foods, and will help to increase your nutrient density if you switch to better food sources, which we'll talk about here in just a second. And it'll also get rid of very refined carbohydrates and sugar sources, so that you can focus more on whole food carbohydrate sources instead. Which, so like we see this relationship with seed oils, and again, it's just they're usually they're coming in these combination foods, right? French fries, or if you're frying in seed oils, usually frying some other food in seed oils, or if you're having chips, they're cooked in seed oils. So there's a lot of times it's just getting rid of these foods altogether. And I think seed oils, we just see with this research, is like one of the biggest factors. But I think in most of the modern diet, they're coming with all of these other things as well, which can make it actually hard to parse out in some of the research, right? Because how do you fully separate this all the time? And that's where your research becomes super valuable here, Chris, because you found a way to actually parse that out. Because you weren't just looking at the food consumption data, you were looking at the production levels for the different countries, and then going from there. Which, obviously you mentioned already, there's a little bit of an overestimate because the production and consumption aren't the same. But I think that's the best way to kind of see these types of relationships. And then you do see, wow, seed oils are a huge factor here. And we're not really seeing it with carbs and with sugars.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So way back in 2019, Mike, I would say way back. I mean, it was just 6 years ago, but that was the first time that I presented evidence to show that that in general, what's happening when people drop their carbohydrate consumption, they're almost always going to simultaneously reduce their vegetable oil consumption. And why is this? Well, it just makes perfect sense because the most people are not pouring vegetable oil into their food. They're getting it from processed foods, as you mentioned, processed foods, restaurant foods, fast foods. That's where they're getting it primarily. Now, there are people that buy vegetable oil and they put it in their food, but here's the thing. If you're eating, if you're eating in a restaurant or a fast food restaurant, and if you eliminate, let's say you go on a low carb diet, that means that you get no potatoes, no rice, no
chips,
wheat, no chips, right? All these kinds of things, for example. Well, that's where the vegetable oils are. And I showed this that back in 2019 that the NIH had already done a study of the top 15 sources of omega-6 linoleic acid, which is the primary omega-6 fat in vegetable oils or in any fat. And that the top 15 sources of omega-6 linoleic acid, 10 of them, or was it 11? 10 or 11 are high carb sources, right? There are things like mixed chicken dishes was what it was, for example. A lot of those come with, they've got potatoes and rice in there, right? And they're high carb sources. And so if you don't know anything, you just go, okay, I'm going to eliminate all carbohydrates. You're going to drop your vegetable oils at the same time. And this is why, as you mentioned earlier, we need to know what are the causative problems in our diets, because if you just think it's carbs, you're sort of misleading yourself, and you may be doing some things that you don't need to do, and maybe even harming yourself in some ways, because the high carb source foods, the whole grains, fruit, vegetables, there are incredible values to these foods. There's lots of, you get all the water soluble vitamins. This is where you get your tremendous sources of calcium, magnesium, potassium, and copper. You get all of these things out of these high carbohydrate foods, and you don't want to eliminate those in my view.
Yeah, and if you don't need to, right? Because the other thing is, and this is where I focus a lot on, is the carbohydrates in and of themselves have value in terms of improving insulin sensitivity, improving thyroid function, helping to lower stress hormones directly, and helping with intestinal function, maintaining the mucus layer, the fiber sources in terms of producing short chain fatty acids, shifting the microbiome, some of the polyphenolic compounds, the vitamins and minerals that you had just mentioned, Chris. So you want to get rid of, when we're setting up the diet, fundamentally, we want to get rid of the toxic stuff, but we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater and say, well, all carbs are the problem. So now I'm going to get organic grass-fed meats, wild-caught seafood, pasture-raised eggs, but I'm not going to have any carbs because carbs are bad. And it's like, maybe carbs aren't the problem, but maybe when you go low carb, maybe when you go keto, maybe when you do carnivore, you eliminate a lot of things that are problematic that happen to like be associated with carbohydrate containing foods. So there's like a conflation that occurs. And I think that's what happens, because for me, that's exactly what happened in my personal circumstances. I went low carb and I felt better, a lot better. And I did IF and all this and I felt a lot better. But I had basically eliminated almost all processed foods. My diet was like beef and spinach and broccoli and eggs and sardines and stuff like this. And my fat sources were olive oil and butter and beef fat and components like this. And so all things that before were bothering me, I just cut out. And it's the same thing that happens with people with carnivore. They're just cutting out of even some of the healthier foods, like legumes and stuff like this. Some people don't digest them well. You take them out and maybe your skin gets better. Maybe your bloating stops. Maybe your mood improves because of the interaction of the microbiome with some of these components and digestive physiology. And it's like, wow, I feel way better. So it must be the carbs. But it's not necessarily the carbs. And then this will tie into your work that we're going to go through in a separate episode. But when you look at ancestral diets, there's not really that many ancestral diets that are zero carb or very, very low carb. There's a few, but it's very rare. And a lot of them have carbs in their diets without having these disease processes at all. They have none of these disease processes that we're seeing in modern day society. And so I think it's very important to figure out what the primary culprits are and eliminate those specifically, and not start conflating a bunch of things together and just saying, oh, it's only carbs or it's only animal foods or whatever the different dietary camp is, or it's fats, right? People say you have one camp and you just need to be low fat. It's all the fats. And it's like, well, some fats are actually extremely helpful and have a variety of benefits. So that's why we want to be clear. And I think that's, your work is helping us to get clarity on what are some of these factors, looking at this from this statistical analysis standpoint, from these big population studies that you're running, or the retrospective analysis on these large population sizes. Then we have some of the different studies on the different groups, these different primal groups or ancestral groups and how they ate. And we also have some RCTs with different components, and we're trying to take all of the information together and try to understand what are the major things from a dietary perspective that we need to focus on to optimize health and not only prevent the disease processes, but to regress them fundamentally, and then go from there and not just start making adjustments to things without and conflating things together and creating diets that get rid of some of the bad stuff, but maybe get rid of some of the good things as well. So I think this is why this stuff is really helpful to see. And again, I want to point out to people, both of us came from a lower carb perspective at one point in time.
Yes.
So we did the low carb thing. It wasn't like I was fully invested in that hypothesis, and it just didn't really play out in reality. I felt better, but then I also ran into problems down the line, specifically because I didn't have carbohydrates that then improved when I had carbohydrates, as long as I chose the right ones, right? I didn't add Doritos back into my diet or anything like this. So that's a really good point.
Right. Yeah. And I've shown before, and I show this in the book, that you can really, many people could probably make their macronutrient ratios sort of all over the board. I mean, in other words, there's a lot of bioindividuality, and this is why I don't try to push some sort of macronutrient ratio. This is the ratio of proteins to carbs to fat. For those who didn't know, but because you can see that these ancestrally living populations do run the gamut from very high carbohydrate to a very low carbohydrate. But as my colleague Suzanne Alexander, who is my co-author on the last book, says, is that there's never been a carnivore population nor a vegan population in ancestral cultures. Never. That even the ones like the Inuit, they're consuming some carbohydrates, even if it's from the stomach of the animals they kill. And there couldn't be any completely vegan populations because they all would have died. Traditionally, this is without supplementation. But anyway, and I don't understand how, the low carbohydrate camps, for example, what is their position when it comes to the fact that the entire Asian culture is known to have existed on extremely high carbohydrate diets for centuries. And I have lots of this evidence for for the Japanese, their carbohydrate consumption was 84% in 1961. 84%. They were phenomenally healthy. And where was all that carbohydrate coming from? This coming from
Rice, yeah.
white rice on mainland Japan, and sweet potatoes on Okinawa. So, how do they? Do you know what is their argument that carbohydrates are just so horrible, and yet, the entire the entire Asian populations contradicts this, in my view.
I haven't really seen, I don't know their exact stance. I think I would straw man it if I did, because I'd have to look it up and see. But I haven't really seen a good answer from some of these groups around these different ancestral groups that you would see that are existing in health on these very high carbohydrate diets. I haven't really seen that be addressed appropriately. I've seen arguments because of genetics or stuff like this. But again, I don't think I don't really think that those arguments directly apply, especially because we see the changes in current times, and you're seeing consumption of the carbohydrates still, and we're seeing these things aren't changing. So I'm not sure what the exact answer would be from that camp. But I fundamentally, when I look at this, and from working with people, and then even when I was looking at the different ancestral diets, and I was going through this stuff, or going through my own journey with the diet stuff, I was like, you would see these different groups that would do fine in a variety of different breakdowns, dietary breakdowns, macronutrient breakdowns. And then I started to think maybe it's not really necessarily the macronutrient breakdowns per se that were fundamentally the problem. And even with clients that I work with, you can see that people will have a wide variety of things that they're going to tolerate. A lot of people like keeping carbohydrates in the diet. A lot of people tend to do better in general, but where that person falls is going to be very person specific and how much of these things they're going to have. So I tend to think of things in terms of the sliding scale and honing it in to that individual, how much protein, how much carbs, how much fat, and just trying to create some baseline starting point that you can adjust from there. And for me, I found that has worked the best. I don't think there's a magical ratio that works for everyone. I just also haven't really seen carbs be the villain that we've been told that they are. And again, you see this even in these different populations, and your work is also showing this as well. So we're not really seeing carbs or sugars or things like this be the villain. And again, this isn't saying to go out and eat tons of refined sugar sources either, or even refined carbohydrate sources like tons of bread products and pastas and things like this. I still fundamentally think that the whole food sources are significantly better from a nutrient density, microbiome shifting, speed at which the carbohydrate hits the bloodstream perspective, and people tend to tolerate those much better. And you see changes in lab values from a clinical perspective way better with those sources than people just eating sugars.
Right.
And I see this, time and time again, day after day. I'm reading labs every single day. I see this all the time. And so that's why I think your work is also really valuable, Chris, because it adds this other lens, this other angle to look at this stuff and say, okay, we just looked at, 4 billion people, and we looked at different relationships between obesity and diabetes compared to dietary components, and we were not seeing a relationship with carbs and sugars, but we are seeing a relationship with vegetable oil. It's that's pretty valuable information to see, and very helpful to have another lens on top of the populations in Dr. Weston A. Price's work, on top of looking at other studies and understanding mechanisms and pathways. We want to get the whole picture together so that we not to just to prove somebody else wrong, but to understand what's going on, so that we have solutions for people, so that we can stop the progression of these disease processes and we can help people regress the disease processes as best as possible.
Right. And Mike, I haven't had a chance to say this, but I just thought I really need to mention the industrial seed oils that people should. The take home message is try to eliminate these: soybean, corn, canola, cottonseed, rapeseed, grapeseed, sunflower, safflower, probably rice bran, and sesame oils. Those are the ones to get rid of. If people say, well, what kind of oils can I have? I would say coconut oil, palm kernel oil. Those are exceptionally good because the omega-6 is extremely low and they're extremely stable. And then if it's pure, authentic, fresh olive oil, absolutely, that would be fine. But we cook everything in butter, everything. And if I needed a whole bunch of oil, I probably would use coconut. I mean, you would or do use coconut oil if I need a whole bunch of oil. But generally, just everything goes in butter is what I think is the easiest thing to do, and it's probably one of the safest ways to go. But
Yeah, and
like I said,
I usually also incorporate people to do like whole fats too. So like for me, I'll do chocolate, I'll do macadamia nuts, I'll do
yeah,
avocados. If there's fat on the beef that I'm going to eat, I'll have the fat from there. So I usually these are the major sources. People can incorporate olives, or they can eat some of the coconut. Like if they have coconut in their food, coconut milk or coconut flakes or whatever the component is. So all of these I think are fine. And yeah, eliminating those sources are helpful. And then yeah, this is major sources that I typically recommend avoiding as well, and then incorporating these other sources, including other dairy fats. If people tolerate the dairy well, then those could be good options. I think those are by far the best options. Those are also options you saw in Weston A. Price's groups. And then again for the carbs, tailing off what you said, Chris, I think doing whole fruits, I think doing tubers, if you tolerate some rice or some oats or something like this, I think that's okay. If you tolerate legumes, I think that those are okay. High quality, like sourdough products are also a good option for people, again, based on individual tolerance. So it's really around structuring the diet from those sources and making sure that you're eating enough for your needs and figuring out which breakdown of carbs and fats is going to work best for your given context. And you feel well, you function well, and your lab values also match to boot with all of that together. So that's how I tend to think about things. And I think we're aligned on the sources. Obviously, like the protein sources that would typically recommend. And again, I have a guide for this on my website that you can print out, mikefave.com, that covers all of these food sources. Chris covers them directly in his book as well and talks directly about the different fats and oils and the breakdown of their omega-6 contents. So I'd recommend you pick up the book, or you could download the guide that I have in my website, because it covers this stuff. And also, my website, I talk about the like targets that I generally shoot for, the ranges that I shoot for, so that you can get started and start to set up the diet. But I'd say the takeaways here are really avoid the vegetable oils, the seed oils as much as possible, avoid the processed packaged foods as much as possible, and then don't be afraid of carbohydrates, but incorporate carbohydrates that are like from whole food sources that we just mentioned.
absolutely. I agree with that 100%, Mike. And I think people should get your guide. That's such a simple, easy take home message, is to get that guide and follow it.
Yeah, you could print it out, put it up on the fridge. But with that, I want to wrap up here, Chris. So before we go, I want to give you the opportunity to tell people where they can find you and your work.
Well, we're going to be posting to our YouTube channel finally, Chris Knobbe, MD, and yeah, the book, that book, or I've also got another book on macular degeneration that are available, on Amazon and wherever books are sold. So we'll have some social media out there available coming soon. But anyway, yeah, those are the main places. People can find me on YouTube and whatnot, and but we'll be working on trying to reach a lot more people with this message. So But Mike, thank you so much. Truly, it's just really an honor to be on your show. I just have immense respect for you and your work and what you've done for people. It's just amazing.
Likewise,
And
Chris,
your
likewise.
knowledge of metabolism is just off the charts. It's just like I've said, you deserve 2 PhDs for honorary PhDs for the work. Truly, there's nobody like you out there.
I
Anyway,
appreciate
so
that,
thank
Chris.
you. So it's an honor to be on your show, truly, and thanks so much, Mike.
Yeah, I appreciate that very much. Thank you. And it's an honor and pleasure to have you on to present this data. I'm really happy that you shared this regression analysis that you did on the podcast. I thought this was, groundbreaking, huge. And then, for people, I really recommend that they check out your YouTube channel, Chris Knobbe, MD. And I really do. I would recommend that people check out this book, Ancestral Diet Revolution. It's great. It goes over the mechanisms of damage from vegetable oils. It goes over some of the graphs that Chris covered here, and also talks about the different ancestral diets. So it's a really great resource to check out to get deeper into this stuff. So I recommend picking up a copy of this book and checking out Chris's new YouTube channel. So with that, we'll wrap up the episode here. Thanks for listening, everybody. And Chris, I'll hope to see you for future episodes.